Work on my Iowa geography. Let me get started on the slide deck here. I'm really excited to share this with you. And I'll just say up top, you're welcome to post questions in the chat. I may or may not be able to see them and read them, but I trust Kirsten, Amy, Kate, some combination of people to interrupt me if there's something time sensitive. But you're welcome to jump in and ask anything that kind of comes to mind, because I am happy to follow the thread of conversation. But just to start with, kind of the purpose here, I'm really interested in trying to connect our interest as an industry in regenerative design principles to climate action and specifically material choice. So we're going to talk through that and first define, regenerative principles, talk about the relationship to climate change, talk about the relationship of the architecture and design industry, our specific segment of the economy, to climate. And then talk about how material choice can support healthier, more vibrant communities, as well as a safer and healthier climate. And so we're also going to just walk through a couple of the tools that will allow you to look seriously at low carbon materials in the toward the end. So again, feel free to jump in, but I'm going to get started. This is a slide, one of a couple in this presentation that I've borrowed from friends. This is actually an AIA slide, as you can see in the bottom right there. And I'm going to talk a lot about design today, but I don't want you to feel like this is only a topic or concepts that can be acted upon by formal designers or designers, who kind of play that role on project teams, because I think we all engage in the design process, whether we want to or not, whether we're invited to or not. Frequently, and with our jobs in terms of tenant fit out, in terms of project management, in terms of facilities, it's all related. And so when we think about the global challenge that faces us with respect to climate, I love this slide because it invites us to consider how design thinking as a process can really play a role in taking on an issue as alarming, as scary, as intimidating as global climate change. And so what can design do? Well, we think about all these different examples of, creating projects and spaces for social change, or for resources and education, or ecological connection, or health and well-being. And design has this capacity, because it is flexible, because it is malleable, because it is powerful, to offer this outcome, all these outcomes that are listed here. But we also know that design can help in a specific project and space capacity. This is the Interface Space Camp headquarters here, where I'm actually sitting today, and you can see just from the interior space here how it invites a kind of vibrancy and energy, and supports the type of collaboration and connection between people who occupy the building, work in the building, or just visit the building, that we really hope that, at least for us and our brand and our values, really hope that our corporate office space could do. And then similarly, we can have this tremendous impact on things like the character or the fabric of a community, of a place. And so the example I'm showing you right now is the fully certified living building project at Georgia Tech, which is really an incredible headliner project. If you're not familiar, it is an academic building that achieved full certification just in the last year or two, making it one of a really quite short list of fully certified LVC projects, but also the first in the Southeast to be certified. And using, in particular, they have some amazing stories around material reuse for this project that give you a sense of history and culture being literally preserved and kind of profoundly presented to you in this space. And so all of the decking that you're seeing here, for example, and even those stairs in the image on the right that blurred lady is walking up, those are all, at least in portion, reclaimed material that would have otherwise been wasted. And there are there's almost infinite kind of stories just within this project of the care that was taken to make the material supply chain part of the story of the building, and part of the benefit to anybody who visits. And so we know design has this tremendous potential to have all of these positive, and I like to try to couch that as restorative or regenerative impacts, right? We are actually creating a positive effect by using these types of materials, not only in terms of limiting our damage, but also in terms of providing a positive experience for those who come through the space. But unfortunately, we know that design and the design and construction industry is also responsible for things like this. This is another thing that design can do. Design with things that come from non-renewable natural materials leads to an economic system that demands, in a voracious way, a tremendous level of access to that material. And it means that we think it is worthwhile as an economy to do this kind of horrific combination of mountaintop removal and strip mining. This is an image of the Alberta tar sands, and I have it labeled as circular economy because it is really the kind of point of what a circular economy is trying to avoid, right? Is this idea of extracting non-renewable resources, using them once and then wasting them. We have to find ways to avoid this type of setting by designing first with what would otherwise be waste, as was the case in the Georgia Tech Candida building, right? And as was the case here in the base camp building with the structure that we preserved and the steel and concrete that we preserved, right? So how do we really challenge ourselves to avoid this type of setting? And how do we challenge design to grapple with the fact that some of the products that we demand create local pollution just by virtue of their supply chain? So an otherwise comfortable, idyllic, neighborhood setting that is literally overshadowed by a chemical refinery that may be part of our global supply chain for products that we specify, whether that is plastic or whether that is a fully realized building material, like an insulation or a steel or whatever. And so how do we recognize that design is also responsible for this? Design can also create this unfortunately and honestly heartbreaking kind of setting where all of the waste that we create and all of the trash that our industry is responsible for gets thrown away, and that away is just somebody else's backyard. So we end up with communities that are literally living in oceans of waste that our industry is in part responsible for, and our economy is generating at an ever increasing rate. This consumption and this trash kind of output mentality is destroying our earth and also having a horrific impact on our communities and our health. And so as I enter into this presentation and kind of talking about regenerative and restorative materials, I want to offer you a couple of big areas of impact to consider that we want to try to have a restorative effect on. And we're going to talk a lot about the carbon footprint of materials and the embodied carbon emissions of materials today. But I wanted to start with some of those other what can design do impacts around chemistry and toxicity and hazardous substances, as well as waste and circular economy, because all of these things are kind of co-equal in importance. They all overlap and they all are mutually supportive when we can get them right. So we have to challenge ourselves. We have to challenge product manufacturers, challenge suppliers, challenge general contractors, challenge designers, challenge facility managers, challenge installers to try to get all of these things right at the same time. And I want you to know too, that idea, what we call our three lenses of health and materials, which is the impact on climate, the impact of toxicity and hazardous substances, and the impact of the circular economy, those are actually really well represented already in the market, including in the AIA Materials Pledge. So I'm not going to belabor this too much. I just want you to feel that there is some sentiment of these impacts being addressed. When the Materials Pledge says support climate health, that's what we're calling the embodied carbon lens. That's what I'm going to talk the most about today. But they also have support human health, which is about those substances that might be hazardous to our health and trying to mitigate the risk that they pose to communities in the entire supply chain, as well as in the use phase of our buildings. And then they use the term circular economy just like we do, because it is the best way to describe building reuse, material reuse, refurbishing, recycled content, perpetual cycling, and even just durability and longevity. So if you're not familiar with the Materials Pledge, you may also or if you are familiar, you may also know that there are two other pillars of the pledge, which is support ecosystem health and support social health and equity, both of which are critically important and both of which are just a little bit outside the scope of my presentation today. I'm really trying to hone in on materials and what we can do for the climate. But of course, those things are directly related to human health and to kind of social equity and impact. So what else can design do, and what else is design doing? Now, this is an image or a series of images that I'm going to start playing right now, and I hope it comes through okay and isn't too choppy for your screens. But this is a computer model that is showing the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere every day for a year in 2006, by the way. So that was probably a pretty high emitting year, actually, but may not be the highest on record, unfortunately. And what you're going to see is the collective impact of all of our Northern Hemisphere industries and even homes generating a huge amount of greenhouse gases and emitting them into our atmosphere. And this is going to get worse still before it gets better. But what I show you this, why I show you this is to share that this is a system that we are already influencing, that we are already having an impact on. And this system is the carbon cycle, which is a natural ecological phenomenon. Because what you're going to notice here is as this concentration gets worse and worse and worse, and people are either heating or cooling their homes, and we are burning fossil fuels for transportation and for industry, you're going to see what happens when the Earth takes a giant breath as the Northern Hemisphere leaves out and summer starts to kind of bloom, right? So look at what happens as the concentration plummets because of all of the natural vegetated material and those vibrant living ecosystems that are pulling that carbon out of the air and actually helping to restore the balance, even in a given year, to our climate and to our Earth's atmosphere. And so what we really need to challenge ourselves to understand is this is an impact already of design, and we are part of a natural system on this planet that we are already influencing and that is already set up to start to heal itself. You can see how much cleaner from a greenhouse gas perspective the air is, the atmosphere is during those summer months and even into early fall here. And you're going to start to see, and I won't make you wait the entire time, you're going to start to see this peel back as the emissions go back up. As the winter comes, people start needing to use heat. And we do things like burn natural gas for heat. And of course, all the leaves begin to drop off the trees. Halloween is kind of a big checkpoint here, I think, as we get closer to that. So if design is already doing this, where we're influencing a carbon cycle, something that pre-existed us by a long, long time, right? Where there was a natural cycle of respiration, of burning, of even decomposition that was putting greenhouse gases up into the atmosphere, but photosynthesis that was drawing that greenhouse gas, especially CO2 in particular, back down and storing it in the food chain, in trees, plants, living things, and eventually even storing it in very dense deposits in the form of fossil fuels that take hundreds of millions of years to create. Well, we came along and by design began to change that cycle, and we threw it pretty dramatically out of whack, right? By taking that long stored CO2 in the form of fossil fuel and fossil energies and putting it up in the air. And what we need to understand is that, again, this is an impact of design. This is one of the things that design can do. But we need to recognize that we didn't set out to try to warm the planet, right? Nobody walked outside one day and was leader of the entire world and said, this place is nice, but it'd be really perfect if it were 2 or 3 degrees hotter on average every year. That was not our intent. So what this slide reminds us is humans had this incredible impact in such a short period of time on the planet by accident. And if we did it by accident, then we can obviously do it with intent. And in fact, I'll go further and ask you to imagine what's possible if we leverage that power, that influence, that impact on purpose. what can we do and what can our industry do, which is where we're going, to try to harness our influence on things like the carbon cycle and try to actually direct it to go in the right direction, right? So this slide reminds us that humans are the most powerful species that has ever been on the planet, and that we screwed up so far. But because we have that capacity, we can make a difference going in the right direction. So where do materials fit in? Why did I just give you this big preamble on the carbon cycle and on restorative impact of buildings and how it relates to CO2? Well, we have to interrogate what our material choices are doing, positively or negatively, for the idea of climate healing or climate repairing architecture. And so we have to understand first and foremost, what's the impact of our industry? Some of you may have seen this slide or know this information or have this data already, but this data comes to us from Architecture 2030, and it is a breakdown of the emissions associated with kind of various sectors of the economy. The 28% building operations emissions number that you're seeing is actually just what it takes to run our homes and workplaces. So that does not include, as you can see, a big chunk of the built environment impacts associated with kind of industrial operations. But what we are starting to learn as a community of practitioners now is that the building materials and construction, the supply chain, the emissions associated with those materials that we use to build our buildings are responsible for at least 11% of emissions every year. And I say at least because you can see that's just structural stuff that is listed, and it doesn't include even interior materials, which we will get into a bit when we talk about things like tenant fit out and the kind of collective aggregated impact of renovation cycles. But in terms of understanding why that 11% number is so critical, we have to understand, and I'll try to make the case for embodied carbon being what we would call the most urgent source of greenhouse gas emissions in our industry. So embodied carbon is represented by the supply chain emissions of all the materials with which we build. And let me explain to you why that's so important. Let's say there was a building built in 2020. There's a massive burp of carbon that goes into the air almost immediately. And that's from the demand of the materials to create that building in the first place. So that's every piece of glass, steel, cement, all the structure, all the envelope, all the insulation, all the wiring, all the finishes, all the furniture, all of that stuff comes with a carbon footprint. You add all that up and it's a substantial amount. Now, of course, over time, that building's operational footprint is going to grow in terms of the emissions it's responsible for and eventually eclipse the embodied carbon impact up front. And by the way, as you can see, this is a 30-year time horizon, and this is clearly assuming absolutely no renovation, right? Which again, we'll return to. But we have to understand that not all carbon emissions are created equal because they don't all happen at the same time. And the stuff that's happening sooner matters more. And it will take 30 years for the operational footprint of that same project. And this is based on global averages, by the way. So we should actually assume that North American buildings, Class A office buildings, like I'm sure many of the ones that our teams work on here, operate more efficiently than this. So it would actually take them longer to catch up with an embodied carbon footprint. It's going to take 30 years for a global average building to have emitted more carbon through its operations than it did in that initial upfront stage of just material selection and specification. So another way to understand that is fully half of the total climate impact of a single project over the first 30 years of its life happened before anybody even set foot inside. It happens in year zero, right? And so as we start to think about things like 2030, the date that all the best science is telling us we need to have radically decarbonized, we probably need to cut our carbon footprint by us as a society in half by 2030. We're going to miss that, and it's not even going to be close if we don't address embodied carbon emissions. So the carbon emissions associated with materials, the carbon footprint of the materials that we use, is critically important to the idea of climate repairing architecture, because it is critically important to our contribution in a negative way to climate change today, right? And by the way, if you look at 2030, the breakdown of operational to embodied carbon isn't 50-50. It's more like 75-25, meaning 3/4 of the embodied of the total climate impact comes from that upfront, supply chain emissions. And the closer we get to 2030, the more skewed that ratio becomes, right? So we can design and build as many net zero ready or net zero buildings as possible, as we want. But we are going to miss our climate targets if we do not do anything about the emissions associated with the materials that we choose to build with. And if you're not yet convinced, think about it this way. Projections are that we're going to we're going to build 2 trillion square feet of new and rebuilt building over the next 35 years. Now, many of you who are practitioners in this field may know exactly how much space that is. I didn't, so this was really helpful for me. Imagine a new New York City's worth of square footage that is every single borough, almost every month for 35 years. It's an unbelievable amount of material that we are demanding. And it is really embodied by concrete, by the way, which has been on everybody's kind of short list of climate offenders in the last year or two. Unfortunately, I think if you're a concrete manufacturer, but fortunately, because we have a lot of room to grow there and we have a lot of opportunity, but concrete is the second most consumed substance on the face of the earth every year. And number 1 is water. So think about the volume of material we are demanding, and that's just concrete. So think about all the plastic, all the metal, all the insulation, all the foam, all the wood that goes into our built environment projects. And where do those emissions come from, and how do we understand them? This is just a quick aside on understanding that the supply chain emissions that I'm talking about go not just back to, as a supplier, my manufacturing facility, but upstream of me in my supply chain. So our business interface predominantly makes carpet tile. Obviously, we have multiple categories as well, but carpet tile has been our core business since we were founded in 1973. The number 1 contributor to the carbon footprint of a carpet tile is nylon fiber. Nylon is an incredibly high-performing plastic. To count the carbon emissions associated with that nylon, you don't just count the energy it takes to punch holes in a primary backing and tuft our designs into carpet. You count the energy and the emissions associated with extraction of oil, processing that oil into nylon monomers, and then extruding that nylon as a beautiful thread with an integrated color that you can then tuft with. And those impacts way dwarf just the energy that we use to sew, essentially, right? So we have to understand that making the product, the full cradle to gate impact, the full supply chain, is really the opportunity that we have to make a big difference. And that's where the embodied carbon emissions really reside. So we're gonna talk just briefly about that renovation cycle, and then we're gonna make a quick turn to kind of a new section of the presentation, and I'll ask for any questions or thoughts, because I know this may feel like a lot and I may be going a little fast. We have to understand that the renovation cycles definitely matter in terms of the embodied carbon footprint of our projects, and therefore in terms of the total climate impact of our industry. So this is a study that was done by the Carbon Leadership Forum, really a thought leader in terms of embodied carbon emissions in the built environment, where they looked at and modeled both all 3 low, medium, and high versions of carbon footprint. And you can see that, especially in the medium and high, the cumulative impact of the tenant improvement process can easily start to approach that initial construction footprint. So even if you are already familiar with the embodied carbon conversation, you probably heard it predominantly in the context of things like structural materials or things like new construction. And that's fine. There's a good reason for that. However, we have to understand that the renovation cycles over time do really add up as well. And they don't actually have the added benefit of mattering very much for the building performance. So we are unlikely to make a building perform better from an energy standpoint by gutting it and rehabbing the interior, right? Most of the work that we can do to improve the performance of building over time is either in MEP or in the envelope, right? Air sealing, water sealing, that kind of thing. So this is just a note to kind of show that interiors do matter. And this was actually echoed by a case study that LMN did up in Seattle, where they looked at the renovation cycle for the building that they are in. They've been in that building since 1983. They modeled the interior fit outs from just before they moved in and the initial fit out from the construction, and then compared it to the total initial impact of the kind of new build, right? The new construction. And as you can see, especially when you account for the difference in concrete's carbon footprint today versus 1960, which is wild to think that's 60 years ago now. The cumulative impact of all those renovation cycles actually eclipse that initial structure, right? So just another piece of evidence that interiors really do matter. And that's kind of the next phase that we'll talk more about as we think again about how do we change our mindset around, if we know that we're doing this stuff by mistake, if we know that we are responsible for these emissions, if this is one of the things that design and construction can do, then what can we do on purpose? And that'll bring us to the concept of regenerative supply chain. So I'm just going to pause here because, again, I feel like I'm going pretty quickly. I don't see anything in the chat. I know a couple more people have moved in since we started. Are there any questions or thoughts before I move into this next section? And I'm just going to take a sip of water. Okay, that was easy. So what is a regenerative supply chain? How can manufacturers, how can your suppliers, your partners, whether you are an actual specifier or whether you are a project management team, how can we have a positive impact on the climate? How can we support a vision for regeneration and restoration? Well, the first thing we have to do is we have to get transparency on the carbon impact that we are already having, and we have to do everything we can to reduce those emissions and reduce that impact, right? So what you're looking at here is the entire kind of carpet tile industry that is available, in North America. So this is basically every major North American made carpet tile. And you can see the carbon footprint listed here. And this is, again, cradle to gate or the full supply chain. This is what I would call kind of the core definition of embodied carbon. The upstream all the way through the final manufacturing process. And a couple things to notice about this chart. Number one, you're going to get a tremendous range. The lowest number here is 2.2. The highest number is 20.7. That means it's almost exactly a 10x difference between the lowest amount of carbon that you could choose to specify and the highest. But also, aside from that total range, there's something to note here, which is just there are a lot of data points, right? There's a lot of information in this category. And that's really helpful because it means that you, whatever your role is in the construction and design process, can check the carbon impact of a given carpet tile product that you're considering using or considering advocating for, and see where it falls in comparison both to the entire category, but also in comparison even just to that same manufacturer's portfolio. Because that's the last point I'll make on this slide. If you look closely at any individual color, pick your favorite color, you can see that there's a pretty big difference in the lowest footprint that manufacturer offers and the highest, at least by percentage, right? So the more that we can get this visibility and the more that we can use this transparency to our advantage, we can signal to manufacturers that we really want them to compete on this. We want them to lower their footprint. We want them to reduce the emissions that they are responsible for, because that's the first step to the idea of climate repairing architecture, is reducing the harm that we are already doing in the design. But I'd like to invite us to think about even going further. So I'm going to give you a picture of two different types of flooring here, right? This is a little woo-woo, but hang with me. The flooring on the left is, taken after a kind of natural form. It's durable. It has a low VOC profile, so it doesn't emit any toxic, fumes, or very, very few, kind of a safe limit of toxic fumes, whatever that means. It's got a good warranty, hopefully. It's in your budget, hopefully, right? And it has a very low carbon footprint, right? It doesn't do very much damage to the climate. But this is all a concept of trying to live zero, trying to reduce the harm that we are overall responsible for. The flooring on the right isn't mimicking a natural form. It is literally alive, right? It is moss. So it is not just durable, it is also self-healing. It doesn't have a low VOC profile. It doesn't not emit very many toxic materials or fumes. It actually emits oxygen. So we can take a deep breath and say, thank you. That's how photosynthesis works. And because it's doing photosynthesis, by the way, it's not just emitting not very much carbon, It's actually carbon storing. It is actually carbon sequestering. It is actually a carbon negative material. And that's the concept of loving carbon, using it as a resource, using it the way nature does as a building block. So how do we learn that trick? Whether it is a human version of photosynthesis or whether it is just the same idea where we take sequestered carbon and we use it as a material that we can build with, that we can actually create a carbon negative product using that, right? And it turns out we actually can do that. And so Interface launched in 2020 a cradle to gate, meaning from raw material extraction all the way through final manufacturing with no offsets accounted for or included, a carpet tile that is carbon negative, that actually stores more carbon in the body of these materials than is emitted to produce all those materials and assemble them together. What this means is we have now line of sight with an industrial company at scale with an industrial product that is not purely natural, like a piece of wood or a wool or natural fiber or cotton or something like that, where we can actually have a regenerative impact on the atmosphere. The more of this product that gets made, the more carbon on a net basis comes out of the atmosphere and stays out of the atmosphere because we are putting it in a commercial product that is going to be long lived, right? And keep that stored carbon sequestered for a long, long time. And just a quick note, I started this presentation talking a lot about the waste that our industry generates, right? And waste is still a problem. And if you waste this carpet tile, then we lose all the stored carbon. However, this process, part of how we have been able to achieve this is by using lots of recycled content and having the capacity to pull the carbon, the sequestered carbon material in old carpet tiles back into our supply chain, reintegrate it, and keep that carbon in a useful life for as long as possible, right? Remanufacturing it, reclaiming and retaking and remaking our product so that that carbon stays stored and stays out of the atmosphere. And the impact is, if you look at our entire portfolio standardized on the amount of nylon yarn that we use for those first styles, is actually, as you can see, a negative footprint. So this gives us a completely different mindset to imagine, okay, well, if we can do this in a carpet tile, where else can we do it? And what is the real potential of not just necessarily this technology to the extent that it is a specific technology, but really this approach, this philosophy? What does it mean that we can have carbon storing, atmospherically, repairing or healing carpet tile material? Well, the good news is there are lots of materials that we can use in the built environment that can be responsible for storing carbon. So if you look at this, this is kind of a business as usual impact for the total carbon footprint of all of the materials at this forensics lab, thanks to Chris Magwood and the Endeavor Center, along with, as you can see, Builders for Climate Action and BEAM, looking into this. They went through that kind of bill of materials and they said, can we find carbon storing alternatives and can we build it this way? And they actually were able to do it. They were able to store actually a substantial amount of carbon in this building, in the materials of this building itself. So that gives us a sense that, wow, this is not only possible in one product category, but maybe it's possible an entire bill of materials. Maybe it's possible for an entire structure. Another example on just the interiors side, the business as usual kind of material renovation process for a 3,000 square foot space is responsible for a big chunk of emissions going into the air, even on a kind of meter squared basis. You can look at reclaimed material, carbon storing material, natural material for interior fit outs and get to a total net carbon storage, even on interior fit out as well. Again, challenging our idea, our concept of what can design do, how much of a benefit can we actually be responsible for when it comes to climate. So I know this is what you're thinking. I'm already in. How can I help? I'm going to pause and see if there are any questions, because I know some of that stuff is a little bit technical and may not feel legit. And I want you to feel like it is completely understood and fair, and that those claims are not marketing claims, but they are actually scientific claims. So if anybody has any questions on any of those last slides I showed, what does carbon storing really mean? How does it really work? Please let me know, and I'm happy to dig in. Okay. And if not,
I think you're good.
okay, I'm going to give you ways to actually get involved. So the first tool that you really need to understand for this type of work is what's called EC3. This is the Embodied Carbon and Construction Calculator. EC3 is a free and open source tool. I'm going to repeat that. It is free. It's a free tool. You don't have to pay for it. It is free. You can't pay for a better version of the tool. It is housed at buildingtransparency.org. All you have to do to get access is log in with your email and a password. And then you will be able to see actually everything I see. I don't have any special permissions or capacity. And what I've done here is just shown you one or two of the outputs from this tool. So if you were to run a basic search on carpet tile with the performance indicators only being made and available in the Americas and tiles instead of broadloom, and then you compare by manufacturer, you can see how the entire category stacks up next to itself in terms of the carbon footprint per meter squared of carpet tile. Now you could change these to things like pounds per square foot if you'd like, by the way, but I just have it as default kilograms of CO2 per meter squared. You can see the high end of the range, you can see the lowest end of the range, and you can see this bar, which is where 60% of the data falls. Now, where is this data coming from? If you read closely EPD type, it's actually coming from those environmental product declarations that your community has been demanding from your suppliers and your manufacturers for the past 10 to 15 years. One of the things that EPDs do extremely well is report the carbon impact of every single life cycle stage of any material that has an EPD published, right? So what that does for you is it gives you a tremendous amount of transparency. But I know, and you know, nobody's really been reading these things because they're complicated, they're not standardized, takes a lot of time, they're confusing. So what EC3 has done, which has been a huge breakthrough for the industry, is take those product-specific EPDs and even those industry average EPDs and pull the carbon footprint data out of it, limit it to just the cradle to gate impact, that full supply chain and final manufacturing stage, and then democratize it so you can actually see how how individual products stack up next to each other, how entire manufacturers' portfolios stack up next to each other, and where everybody falls in relation to the entire category, right? The other output of EC3 that I think is worth understanding is once you've selected specific materials that you want to work with, if you know your quantities or if you're willing to estimate quantities, you can load them in and start to build out the entire project and see, okay, because I picked this carpet tile, this ceiling tile, this piece of gypsum, and this type of insulation, how does that relate to the rest of that category? How much am I reducing from a kind of given baseline in each of those categories? And therefore, how is it all adding up to my target of trying to design a 50% below baseline building with this specific bill of materials? So if you're interested in learning more about EC3, please reach out to us. We do live demos. We have actual CEU for it. But you also, I just encourage you to check out buildingtransparency.org. You can figure it out on your own. And there are other resources out there. You don't even have to call me to kind of learn about it and start poking around in it. But it is a really powerful tool based on incredibly good, robust, and valuable data in the form of environmental product declarations that allows you to see how one material choice versus another is going to save a tremendous amount of carbon or not. And then the other big tool is another free one that I want to share with you is the Carbon Smart Materials palette. Now, the Carbon Smart Materials palette, I think, is a better place to start than EC3. If you or people in your firm, your colleagues, your team members, your dog, toll booth workers that are unfortunate enough to get you on this subject, whatever, want to learn about embodied carbon and kind of understand where it comes from, this is where I would steer them. Because if you click into any of these materials that are listed here, you're going to get a qualitative analysis, kind of like a magazine article, about where the emissions come from in the life cycle of that product. So for something like insulation or concrete, where are the process emissions that are generating greenhouse gases? What is the carbon footprint of all the energy used to make those products? And what are some rules of thumb to try to reduce the impact of that material category when you use it? So again, getting back to carpet, for example, because nylon is the #1 driver of the carbon footprint of carpet tile, well, the #1 way to reduce the carbon footprint of carpet tile is to specify high recycled content nylon because recycled content is a lot less energy intensive to make than virgin, for example. But you'll get that same type of rule of thumb from everything. And then on the carbon smart materials side, this is where we're going to get back to some of those slides from, for example, the Endeavor Center, looking at natural materials that, again, were once alive. We're storing carbon, whether it's wood, whether it's another plant material, whether it's a filler, that will allow you to build with sequestered carbon and be responsible for locking that carbon away so that we don't put it up into the atmosphere and we actually start to reverse the trend of global warming. So that's all the slides I have for you now. I would love to hear any thoughts, any questions, if you have them, and I can pull up anything from the presentation or any other resources that occur to me if it seems appropriate.
Yeah, wow, that was awesome. Lots of great information, Joey. That's yeah, great resources for our facility managers or just anybody that's in the industry to kind of help find better ways to help the climate. So yeah, thanks so much.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, did anybody have haven't seen any.
I have one quick question.
Hey, Kate.
So I think that this is probably not, I think you may have mentioned it, but that EC3 tool, does that measure all, I mean, obviously it measures all those types of materials that you showed in your slide, but how, I mean, how is that measured with existing space? Are they able to use that tool to see the impacts, or is it specifically?
If you know it's actually a really good way to introduce yourself or your teams to the tool is to go to a past project and just try to find the materials that you've used and in the quantities that you used them in EC3. And then build out that project, build out that building project in the EC3 tool so you can get a sense for, honestly, and this is a point that I managed to not make in the many, many slides and much talking that I just did. We're at a place in the kind of life cycle of action on embodied carbon that there is, and I cannot stress this enough, no price correlation between a low carbon versus a high carbon footprint product. And the reason for that, and I think that this is going to drive it home because it's going to make sense to you, nobody has been rewarding manufacturers for having a lower carbon footprint or polluting less. And vice versa, no one has been punishing manufacturers for having a high carbon footprint or polluting more. So that's important to EC3 because you go back in time, you look at a project that you've done, and just by accident, without even knowing it, you may find that you're 20% below baseline. Because the products that you tend to choose, because you were choosing them on price and availability and because you like the rep and because of the aesthetic or whatever, they actually also just happen to be lower carbon products than the baseline. That is completely like realistic. If you want to really push yourself, you do that exercise, you find, okay, we were 10% below a baseline for this bill of materials. We'd like to push ourselves to be 30% below as a standard kind of value add to our projects or our fit outs, right? And there are, I know that this group is, there are lots of different firms and organizations represented, so I'm not going to name any names here, but there are partners between suppliers, design firms, and even property management firms that are looking at how do we create a package of low carbon footprint materials that we can offer to the market as, again, a kind of value add service, not as a separate business line, but if you're a brand that cares about the climate and you would like your interior fit out to be measurably less carbon intense than a typical fit out, we can do that for you. And here are our go-to suppliers, right? So that is a movement that is still building. And I think that that work is coming. And I encourage everybody to think about how you play a role in that. And using EC3 is a really good place to start to kind of get educated on what's my firm's baseline, what are my project teams doing by default, what can we already take credit for, and where do we want to push to go further as well. And so I actually always encourage, in particular, design firms who are interested in EC3 to not start on a client's timeline. Don't put the pressure on it to do that, right? Use it as a summer internship project. Go back to an already award-winning project that you are really proud of and just try to find the materials that are in there. So Kate, you know, to specifically answer, how does it measure? Well, it's not live, it's using existing product data. And so whether you're building that building in 5 years or 15 years ago, if you can find that specific product or a, you know, a legitimate kind of equivalent or analog, and it has an EPD in the system, it'll spit back out the carbon footprint of using that amount of material for that specific product.
Makes sense. Great. Thanks
Cool.
for all that information.
Absolutely.
Really interesting topic for me.
Glad to hear it. Okay. Any other brave souls out there? Otherwise, we've just got 10 minutes of staring at me in silence, so that's fine. Okay, Kirsten, you can bring us home.
Right. Well, thank you again, Joey. And I know, I think Amy's in the background there too, but thanks for, you guys to, you know, bring this to us and be a part of this, and, you know, great information for all of us to kind of take back and process and, you know, all that kind of good stuff. Also for everybody there, this will be on our website on the IFMA Central Iowa chapter. So if there's other people you want to share it with, and I think Joey, you had your, email and information up on the screen, that if anybody needs to, you know, reach out.
I'll just type it in the chat for y'all as well, just in case you need it. That's my personal email. You can also always reach out to the sustainability@interface.com inbox to reach our entire team. And there's Amy. Thank you, Amy, for the local contact as well.
Yes. So
I wanted to mention too, to anybody on the call, I know it is a lot of information, but if you ever felt like you wanted to share it specifically for your office or for your team, maybe you want to get a sustainability team within your workplace involved as well, you can always reach out to me, and we can have Joey do something, you know, even tailored to your organization as well. So
there are other people too. You don't have to be stuck with me, by the way. Yeah, start with it.
Lots of people. No, just kidding. Well, thank you again, and hope everybody has a fantastic day. The sun shining out there a little bit, or at least brighter. And thanks again. Yeah. All right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for the opportunity. Have a great day.
Thanks so much, you guys. I really appreciate you joining us.
Yeah. Good to see you, Kate. Bye.
Bye-bye.